Welcome to Greenwich and the Environment. I'm Diva Wareing, your host, ready to take you on a journey through the heart of creativity, culture, research, and sustainability at Greenwich. So, whether you're passionate about the planet or just curious about the hidden forces shaping our world, stick around. This is where sustainability meets creativity. Let's get started. We shape societies, and in turn, societies shape us. But in an era of environmental crisis, can participatory and immersive storytelling help us to build a more inclusive and sustainable future? With me in the studio today, we have Professor Jorges Lopes Ramos, an expert in immersive theatre, participatory storytelling, and accessibility. George is deeply involved in Larpocrasy, a European research project exploring how live-action role-playing, LARP, can lower barriers to participation in political and social decision-making. His work, influenced by his early life experiences in Brazil, bridges theatre, community engagement, and sustainability. Larpocrasy brings together 7 partners, including multi-award-winning ZU UK, led by Persis Jage Maravella and George, which has over 2 decades in research of immersive performance and a partnership with the University of Greenwich since 2019. The project focuses on lowering barriers to participation, making immersive and performative methods more accessible to diverse communities. We're here today to discuss how creative engagement, embodied storytelling, and participatory practices can lead to new ways of thinking about democracy and sustainability. Hi, George. How are you today?
Hello. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. This is such an interesting take on sustainability, because I don't think that when you think of sustainability, you immediately think of immersive theatre, and yet there's so much that you are doing with your company and your practice that is really introducing and helping to enhance sustainability and make it connect with diverse audiences. So I think that's, first of all, incredible. Your work has long explored the intersection of theatre, narrative, and social engagement. What first drew you to immersive storytelling?
I guess the way that my practice and my research developed wasn't necessarily framed by immersive practice, mainly because the term wasn't used and it wasn't used in the same way at the time. But secondly, because we tend not to use the word immersive to describe what we do, only because it's not what's driving the inquiry or the practice. For instance, when we are interested in a specific engagement with a specific audience in a place or a time or a provocation, immersive engagement may be a consequence of it, it may not. And so I guess the element of immersive that is relevant to what I'm most interested in is usually to do with interactivity. And I mean that in a sense that from early in my practice, I was very fortunate to meet Augusto Boal in Brazil whilst, well, he was still alive, but also practicing. And encountering theatre of the oppressed, socially engaged practice, and theatre that had a grounding in, urgent social uncomfortable questions meant that, okay, I feel there's a purpose to being present or to being with these people right now. And most of my other experience of theatre, almost all of my experience with a few exceptions, had been a detachment from something happening on the stage in front of me that ignored my presence, but also most of the time I felt had no purpose. It may be distracting enough if it's excellent in terms of an art form. I mean, someone who's very skilled or really beautiful music or design, the things you appreciate. But in terms of theatre or a gathering of live people in a place, I couldn't for the life of me get to grips with this event, this form. Theatre is a form that confined itself to a play on a stage, and so I never really connected with that type of theatre. So my whole practice has been a way of investigating models that create more meaningful engagement.
Yeah, I feel that. My original background was in performance, and I think sometimes I found the struggle with finding meaning within some of the things I was doing and feeling like especially if I was doing any commercial work, I kind of feel like this doesn't feel like art forms. So I completely empathize and understand this feeling of somehow of disconnect and wanting to give back or do something more with your talent in your art form.
Yeah, and with immersive practice, I guess what is unfortunate is the majority of what today is framed as immersive is very problematic, mostly unethical, low quality, mainstream commercial ways of producing something quick, irresponsibly for a lot of money
Mm.
in return. So the models you have representing immersive practice as a whole tend to prey on people who want to be, in a kind of trend or something that's cool, and they're ready to pay a lot of money for it.
Mm.
However, the potential of what immersive could have been, or is in very, very rare instances, is a real acknowledgement of who's in the room and the individuals that are there, and kind of encouraging a kind of individual and collective transformation and exchange that can only happen because people are there and they're curious and they're generous. So most of the models out there feel like a huge waste.
Yeah. And as a performer, you get to connect with people in a different way, I imagine,
Mm.
than you would as if you were on a traditional stage and audience.
Yeah, I think if you are a performer who is interested in kind of a more meaningful encounter that is different depending on the person you meet, there are people who might be interested in improvisation or might be interested in socially engaged practice. They usually go hand in hand because you can't ignore who's in front of you and you can't ignore what they give you. And so, just by the fact that you are open and you need to respond, it means you need to listen. And if you need to listen, then you're ready to empathize and you're ready to change.
I think that sounds very good. And I think that's a massive part of performance as a whole and why performers are seen somewhat more empathetic. Because you have to listen when you're on stage. If you're not listening, you're not there. And you don't know whether the line they just said was the line and they dropped the ball or if you need to respond. And yeah, it's like performing 101 really. You need to listen. Um the current project you're working on is Larpocrasy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
Larpocrasy is a project developed and run by a number of organizations in the UK and Europe, who've come together a few years ago to conceive a project that could explore LARP as a methodology, as a practice, and also what we refer to as LARP adjacent practices. So, my work, my research is a LARP adjacent practice. I'm not a LARP practitioner, but yet my practice has many overlaps, and both LARP communities and the work that we do can see a mutually beneficial exchange to be had where we can learn from each other's practices and disciplines. So, in terms of the work that I do, University of Greenwich, and in partnership with ZG UK, that focuses on the LARP adjacent practice, and it focuses on lowering barriers for participation. And the reason why we thought it was an excellent opportunity to come together with this incredible group of people, practitioners, researchers, artists, activists across Europe, was because I guess there's a curiosity about what works and what doesn't work about LARP today and LARP adjacent practices, who it excludes, um, as well as its potential, depending on its context and how it's conducted. So we're very interested in picking apart those tools, approaches, and experiences of very specific communities. In our case, Belém based artists in and around the Amazon, in the state of Pará, in the north of Brazil. So our focus will be working with Belém based artists who may have an artistic practice already, may or may not be aware of LARP as a practice, but ultimately who are interested in having their own voice heard in terms of how they experience the climate disaster from their point of view and the communities they work from, live in, engage with. So our role really is to develop a kind of residency model, structures, mentoring, and support to raise the support mechanisms for those artists to develop their work and to showcase it as part of COP30.
Nice. Can you explain to us a little bit about what Belém is like? What does it is it a big city? Is it smaller? What are the people like there?
Like anywhere in Brazil, and there are similarities and differences, but you have very big social challenges and significant poverty, as well as a minority with a lot of money and privilege. So you will have sections of the society that are uh, very privileged, and you have a huge issue with basic infrastructure access that goes back a long time. In Belém specifically, because it's placed in and around the Amazon, and because it's in the north with very little access, geographically very distant from bigger cities, from the capital, Brasilia, but also from the southeast where a lot of the kind of financial and touristic activity of Brazil happens in São Paulo, Rio, and so on. It means that artists in Belém, for example, find it very hard to be part of opportunities anywhere else in Brazil. It's incredibly expensive for them to leave. And with COP30 happening now, what's happened is this mad rush from the local authorities to increase infrastructure. There's no existing infrastructure, but also lack of accommodation, access. Recently, I read they were cutting down a huge amount of trees to create another highway.
Yeah, I saw that as well. Yeah.
And
Seems ironic.
I mean, that's a perfect representation of this, this sort of last minute rush to try and accommodate an event which is beyond Belém's capabilities. And the other part of it is that it doesn't really involve, and has the benefits of the people who live there in mind. And that's what we wanted to change with this project.
Yeah. Are there any positives for the people of Belém and this COP happening?
It'll be hard. I mean, it'll be hard for me to say in a way that represents, the diversity and lived experience of people in Belém. I might know more by the time we've finished the project, but we are trying to, in a way, ensure that there are benefits by creating a platform that is solely focused on local artists having a presence and a voice, provides some financial support, provides professional development, international opportunities, but ultimately that there is some space for a local narrative in a place that is usually dominated by a Western narrative of climate change.
Interesting. What do you think are the biggest challenges that stop people from engaging in political or social decision making? And how do you think your work and your project can help to address this?
That's a big question for the Larpocrasy project as a whole. Part of our activities that we started last month, where we all came together, had very much some of those questions in mind, and they're not easy to answer. But some of the elements involve, lack of trust, disinformation, misinformation, a kind of disengagement from this understanding or this realization that you can't make a difference, lack of mobilization, and so on. So we are very aware that it's not an issue that is particular to cultural organizations or geographical locations. It's everywhere. So what we're trying to do is just focus on what it is that we can have an impact, a positive impact on. And for us, that is leaving helpful tools to artists that they can continue to benefit from. One of the things that isn't happening in Belém at all is the day after COP finishes. What happens apart from clearing up the rubbish and people returning to their homes, and what happens? What's after COP? That's one of the questions that we talk most when we in Belém. I visited recently, and it's almost like people in Belém is like everyone's talking about COP, but what about after? What's going to happen?
That's a really good
We're going to
point.
still be here.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the project that we're working on focuses exactly on that.
Yeah, what happens, how many people use this giant highway that they've just built once COP's gone? How many people, I'm sure there's new buildings being built and things like that. How many buildings get used? Yeah, that's a really good question. And it sounds like this project is vital for highlighting this as well.
Yeah, in a small way.
Yeah, but I mean, highlighting what happens when a big event such as COP or anything similar leaves.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So ZUUK is producing a lot of work around touch, empathy, and sound. How do these sensory elements help make participatory storytelling more accessible and inclusive?
So the work that I do with ZUUK, and that's in partnership with Professor Jorges Lopes, as you mentioned earlier, comes from also her interest in the role of the body and a kind of embodied engagement with the world, not just a kind of activation of what our bodies are capable of, but also how much we disregard the body when we talk about experiences of the world, right? We tend to hyper conceptualize them, and especially for a kind of neurotypical privileged situation. It's sort of verbal. It's predominantly visual, but where the body isn't a part of that consideration. If anything, as Jaj would also say, if you tend to represent a kind of alternative to that mainstream or to that perceived majority, you're almost expected to declare, right, in a scenario, your lived experiences, where there is disability or the color of your skin or your gender, in a way that anyone who feels, be it because of whiteness or patriarchy, uh, that they don't have to declare, right, what they bring. So their body is non-existent. Is almost like they can just talk about ideas, right? So a strong part of Jaj's work and mine is to ensure that the body belongs to that conversation of how the world is understood and the presence you have as part of a kind of starting point. And as a result, when we talk about different designs of, for example, immersive or serious games or LARP or technologies, visual technologies tend to replicate that kind of mainstream understanding of culture. So VR is very popular, and immersive projection and so on, because it's over there, right? You see it, you control it. It's a bit like, oh, I see, I understand, I see, I conquer, I see, I have it. And if you take away the visual and you have to listen or you have to feel, immediately the body is part. You cannot, right? You cannot remove yourself from that experience. Therefore, you shift already before you even started. If you have to listen, you have to consider what surrounds your body. You have to consider, if you're considering touch, a range of associations and power structures and relationships. So our desire to focus more on audio and touch and non-visual forms predominantly is to bring that sense of embodiment to the conversation.
That's really interesting because one of the earlier episodes we had was with Hannah Lamin and Anushka Athik, who their piece of research was about embodied practice and taking participants out into nature to use their bodies. And it seems like the use of bodies in sustainability and in nature is so important and so vital to getting us out of this sort almost just visual 2D world that we're all kind of in, and to getting us to sense the world in a different way. And I think something like immersive theatre would be like a great way to bring it to people in a more accessible way.
I mean, what I would suggest is that immersive theater would have the potential to, in most situations, very much replicate the privilege, the lack of access, and the irresponsible practice. So we tend, I mean, it's inevitable to talk about immersive because our work has been framed as immersive in academia, in reviews, it's inevitable. It's something that, it belongs to a kind of framing, historical framing. But when we talk about our practice, we often refer to serious games or playful things or LARP or interactive practice. And the reason being is to try and focus back on what the invitation is, right? So, for example, rather than a company or a researcher or an artist that produces immersive work, which is certainly not my case, it's not our case, we are practitioners interested in how do we frame this invitation to this individual or this community. So first of all, who are they? Where are we? What is the invitation? And that then defines what happens, as opposed to let's make a VR thing. It's like, why? Why VR? Why not pen and paper? Why not a moving train? It feels so random. So in a way, we try to talk about two things. We talk about who is it by, who is it for, who is it with? Because if you consider that from the beginning, you then consider who's not in the room, who should be in the room. Because the moment those conversations start, it starts shifting immediately your assumptions. And you go, oh, of course, why are we talking about this? Makes no sense. It saves everyone a lot of hassle. It saves money, it saves stress, it saves replicating these oppressive systems, right? So immediately, whatever your practice, make sure whoever you are making things with and for, that they're involved from the beginning. The second thing we talk about is hacking the familiar. Hacking the familiar is a simple idea, which is to start from something that is familiar to the people who you're inviting. So for instance, rather than say to a certain community of people, and by community I mean any grouping of people that has a similar shared experience, either because they grew up in the same location or they have a similar economic background or culture, or it depends on what you're interested in or who you are. But once you have identified the desire to work with a community, like what's already their culture, what's already familiar and empowering to them, and maybe start from there rather than create something from scratch and having to convince people, look, this is really cool, you should come to this. And they're going to go, why? And I would ask that question. You go, oh, you know what? You're really into karaoke, aren't you? Oh, yeah, I absolutely love karaoke. Okay, here's a slightly different version of a karaoke. Would you like to give it a go? Why not? Right? It's a small leap because it's something that I feel I can be myself or I enjoy. Oh, but there's this curious thing about it, right? So an example of that project was Binaural Dinner Date, where instead of going, here is a public space installation with binaural sound and immersive blah, 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 just like, would you like to sit in a cafe and have a date? And people can say yes. Or they can say no way. But if they say yes, they're pretty sure it will involve things that you would expect from a date. It will be unpredictable. You might not know the person. You might like them. You might not. It'll be a bit tense at times. It might be funny. So those things are already part of the invitation because they're familiar with that. And if they said yes, that's a huge part of it. That they are like, it's honest. Oh, but then there's these other things here, right? That we play with. Oh, and then it goes somewhere else and then it becomes a very strong experience. But you don't start from that, right? You start from those are elements that we think are really key to lowering these barriers, because a lot of the time it's just how people talk about things. It's just so alienating. But it's sort of cool for a small group of people that just kind of produces things for each other and just stays there
Yeah.
eating its own tail.
How do you think LARP and other performative methods can create more empathetic and engaged communities?
So part of the practice of focusing on embodied design, on interactive engagement and listening, as we spoke about earlier, means that you in a situation as an individual where you are more open to the world. And if you are listening, you're in a place that usually day to day life, we are very rarely, right, in that place because we are in our own bubbles. We are reinforcing things we already believe in. We're only talking to people who we like the opinion of. But if you're in a place that's slightly different, is not your place, is familiar enough, but for you to want to stay there and not leave, but it's also curious and is unexpected, and you meet people who you wouldn't have met otherwise, you are already a bit more open to listening to other points of view, considering other lived experiences, which ultimately is empathy, right? Empathy really isn't a kind of feeling sorry for someone and nodding if they're in pain, but it's ultimately quite an uncomfortable, hard process, which doesn't necessarily mean you even agree, but you consider and you listen. And as part of social engagement, democratic engagement, if you can't deliberate, if you can't exchange even opposing ideas to get to a common goal and agreement, you can't even start.
And with your current project in Belém, what sort of things have been coming out of this, or do you expect to come out of this project? And how have the artists that you're working with um, given any feedback? Have they given any feedback from what they've currently been working on?
So the project in Belém also comes from uh, a- another research project around touch and sound. And that does include collaborations with blind and visually impaired artists in Liverpool and in Brazil. And what we have already done, even though it's very early days for the project, is conduct kind of R&D, so research and development labs around what are the possibilities of technologies, of game design, of LARP, if we start from lived experience of touch and sound from people with neurodevelopmental disorders, trauma, and visual impairment or blindness. So that is what we have started with. And what we very quickly get to is an extremely diverse set of experiences around visual engagement, even within the community with what you would expect is a similar disability. And so the focus is allowing artists who have a disability, neurodivergence, or who have experience of trauma to lead the practice. And so when we eventually shape this invitation, it becomes an artwork or an experience, it's already embedded in it. So you don't think of access as a afterthought. The process itself is a dive into ways of experiencing the world different to what we usually expect in, especially in the arts.
So, immersive theatre, or, you know, theatre similar to what your project's like, can be off putting to some people when you first say it. I say this as somebody who has a performance background and who is friends with people who do not have performance backgrounds. If I say, look, come with me to this one man show or come with me to this immersive show, they're like, wait a minute. No, 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 no. I don't want to be involved. I don't want them to pick on me. I don't want to be seen. So, thinking of those people, how do you connect with them? How do you make them feel like, okay, I'm not going to single you out, or even just make them a little bit more interested?
First of all, I completely understand, and sometimes I am one of those people. Um, if the invitation to whatever it is either overly ambiguous or weird, I myself don't want to put myself in those situations. So I very much understand and don't blame those people for not wanting to put themselves in those situations. Um, how we think about it is what are you doing, what you're making, and what you're describing. The description of what you do, if it is your intention to engage audiences who are not already privileged and interested in that niche thing that you're doing, if you're genuinely interested, then it's about how can you be honest, first of all, and upfront about what is it that they will be expected to do or see, or so ultimately they can make an informed decision. They're not tricked. And so, for instance, instead of, I mentioned earlier, right, the binaural dinner date, instead of saying, here's this binaural sound installation, blah, 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 I would say, well, start from the thing that they know the most likely is what a date is like. Or with Radio Ghost, rather than saying, come for this pervasive media, public space intervention, and so on. People, they're going to go, what are you talking about? Do you want to play a ghost hunt in a shopping? And although it's not a perfect description of what it is, it really gets to it in a way that it's accessible. And people can say, no, I actually don't want to play a ghost hunt in a shopping mall. But if they say I do, they won't be disappointed, because what follows is, right, this is what is similar to a ghost hunt, and this is what is not similar. And if they still want to, then they've got a very good reference point. Or with Pick Me Up and Hold Me Tight, we had all the UK public phones ring at 11 a.m. on the 1st of January to mark the peak of suicides in the UK. Now, the invitation is, do you want to pick up a ringing phone at 11 a.m. on the 1st of January? And it's not confusing. You can say yes, you can say no. You get a sense of the purpose, you get a sense of the invitation. You don't know what's going to happen when you pick up the phone, but ultimately, it's an honest invitation. So that's what I ultimately would say. Just be upfront about what it is that you're proposing, so people are not there under false pretenses.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of getting people into immersive theatre, because sometimes it can be a bit like you go there and you're a bit like, what is this? Why is it not exactly how I thought it was going to be? So Larpocrasy is a 3-year project. What are some of the most exciting developments so far, and what are you looking forward to exploring next?
It is really early days. So it's hard to talk about too many developments. But what I can say is, as a result of the project, we have become aware of a huge Brazilian LARP community that we were only vaguely aware of and now are collaborating with, and have been really surprised by how far back that LARP history goes in Brazil, and also how closely aligned with the less, I guess, Nordic LARP traditions are. And the Nordic LARP within LARP is a very well established sort of culture of LARPing from Nordic countries. And actually, I guess, and it shouldn't be surprising, because of who is leading those LARPs in Brazil, because of the rich history of socially engaged practice, it is in many ways already more accessible and more reflective of the communities that participate in the LARP history in Brazil. So that has really excited me to research deeper the history of LARP in Brazil.
Do you think you'd work with them more in the future?
We are already working with them as a result. So, and this is what has happened actually quite fast, is the organizations that weren't officially part of the collaboration to start with have become so excited about the project that have just approached us without us even trying very hard. And the conversations have been incredible.
And how do you think that performance culture, but also culture in general, has changed from when you were growing up in Brazil to now?
So I was born right at the end of dictatorship in Brazil. And so Brazil hadn't had yet a democratically elected president by then. Or yeah, it was at the end of that period of, dictatorship was coming to an end, but presidents still were appointed by the military. And now we have had a range of presidents and different governments, And one thing that has happened, and it comes and goes depending on which government's in charge, is the focus on representation across Brazil as a whole, and the value of and the richness of the culture of very different communities in Brazil. So that's more in evidence. People more aware of it. Some infrastructure is in place, although it's nowhere near um, enough. And I think there are more organized movements in Brazil outside of, I guess, during the dictatorship, it was more a kind of a student-led resistance, mainly, which was more visible. And now there are a large number of incredible political movements in Brazil that put their life on the line every day, and some of them have had their lives taken just for speaking up.
Yeah, and there's quite a few sustainability activists in Brazil, isn't there, who have also run into problems with loggers and other,
Being killed.
yeah,
Yeah.
with other people who are contributing towards a negative climate or planet. In terms of COP as a general, you're going to be in COP at COP30 this year, which is very exciting, first of all. But recently there have been a lot of controversies around COP, like the fact that there seems to be a shift towards big petrol heading up a lot of the conversations. As someone living through the experiences of Belém, are there any insights you can give from communities local to the area that may have heard anything about any stuff that isn't exactly either things that they might not be entirely happy with the COP process or things that are working well?
Uh, as of now, I haven't heard of things that are working well. Only
Only negative.
only the dissatisfaction
That's
of
interesting.
those people in Belém with COP and its arrival and what it means for them, and the lack of participation that they have. I do have partnerships with organizations or institutions who are hopeful, but as of now, still have big question marks about what's actually going to happen. Things are going to be decided very last minute. There'll be a lot of top down decisions at the last minute. So instead of relying, we decided on this very early on, not to rely on the official structure of COP30. I mean, we're definitely having all the conversations that you would have, planning as you would, but with plans B and C and D and E, because we don't want to put the fate of the local artist in the hands of someone randomly deciding that they are doing a thing or not doing a thing. So we are doing it whatever happens. We will have the spaces and the support and the artworks which will go on, whether or not someone decides to put them in this program or that program. Or so that's the one thing. Also, as a Brazilian, I've learned you don't wait for permission. You do it, and if you do get permission and support, fantastic. And if you don't, you still true to the people you're supporting.
Hmm. And there's a lot of artists and performers that are involved with COP30 and a few COPs in the past as well. What role do you see for artists and creative practitioners in shaping climate conversations?
So this comes from someone who isn't a climate activist, and my artistic practice isn't primarily focused on sustainability, although many projects that I've done do. So, in my limited experience of artistic engagement in climate conversations and settings, it's ultimately, I think, about experience, being able to shift perceptions and mindsets. So about people being able to ultimately see world in a different light, consider other people, consider themselves differently.
The intersection of creativity and sustainability is a recurring theme in this project. How can performance, role playing, and storytelling contribute to environmental activism and policymaking?
As part of Larpocrasy, um, there is significant work happening around policy, although I'm not directly involved with that. So I'm also very curious and keen, A, to support it when it happens, and B, to find out the outcomes of that work package and that work. When it comes to activism, I think our focus in serious games, LARP, and interactive practice means that as part of the design of an experience, as part of you as an individual in that environment, you have to perform a role. Like, if you have to make something with your hands, you will have made it. If you have to negotiate with fellow players to reach an outcome, you have to actually go through those processes. You're not just playing out something that someone's told you to do. You will have to find your way. And that is a kind of, you know, a step into activism if you've never experienced or thought of yourself as someone who could be engaged in activism, which is to have a role, to have an engagement, to engage in planning, discussing, and ultimately doing something. Um, One of the elements that we had that we really, really wanted to keep in Radio Ghost is that at the end of the ghost hunt, one of the tasks that you have to do in order to win, in inverted commas, the game, but ultimately what you're doing is you're winning for each other. You're a group of 3 players and you're doing it for each other. So you have the responsibility with the group. And what you have to do is you have to stop still in the middle of a busy shopping center for 60 seconds in order to progress. And that might sound like, what is 60 seconds and what is just stopping and standing still? However, what happens is a lot of people have never had the experience of disrupting a flow around them and not being compliant. And even though it is literally as simple as standing still for 60 seconds, the resistance they feel, where everything around them wants them to move, consume, look, buy, get out of the way, means that they suddenly, and this is their own words, feel like, wow, I've been engaged in this tiny bit of activism. And hopefully that might also awaken an understanding that, well, I can have a role. What the role is, how much will it impact? Is it a solo thing? Is it a community thing? That's ultimately up to, what people want to do. But it just changes slightly that perception people have, oh, I can't do anything, it's just me, or, oh, I wouldn't be able to handle it, or I don't have the, and you go, oh, I, I could do something. But we very careful not to say what they should do, but just to open the space for them to consider and realize that, yes, we do have a lot more available to us than we think we do, or we are conveniently convinced.
Yeah, because I guess it's like a baby step on the ladder to making bigger change. Like me and a friend of mine were talking about Christmas and how in Christmas time, you know, parents, for example, are kind of sort of socially forced into buying children lots and lots of toys. And it is very expensive for families that can't afford it. It's also very wasteful for the planet. But also, the idea of stopping that and the idea of saying, no, I'm not going to do that. It's like, it's quite difficult as a parent, I imagine, because then you're not saying, no, I'm not going to do it because it's bad for the environment and it costs too much money. Because actually you've got like an emotional child there that it's representative of something different for the child. And I think in that sense, like, we were having this conversation and we were saying how difficult it would be to do that. Logically it would be, but in person it would be quite tough. And I think even just on the micro scale of standing still in a busy shopping center where everything around you is like, oh my God, I'm in the way. there's people that I'm like, people might bump into me and things like that. I think that even just doing something like that, it encourages you, oh no, you can do something different. You can make a difference. And resisting is not necessarily a bad thing. So this is something that we ask all of our guests. It's really easy to dwell on the challenges of social and environmental crisis, but we want to build a vision for a positive world. So I guess the question really is, what does a hopeful vision, a hopeful future of 2050 look like to you?
Couple of things. In the last few months, couple of years, I have at times found it hard to think of anything else but of the power of, the status quo. And the moment that it threatens to destabilize something that is inconvenient, it's really clear that it's a huge mountain to climb. I have to empathize with people who find the idea of activism or making a change or engaging democratically. I have to just empathize and go, it's really bad. And I don't blame you for thinking you can't make a difference. So that's one side. And then the other side is, and this is coming back a lot actually in conversations around climate, but also in conversations around just the future of arts or the future of disability arts or the future of research, diversity, inclusion. In these conversations, the word hope keeps coming back. But I think one of the things I've learned a lot is that hope can be a very oppressive idea. Um, Not feeling hopeful or hopefulness, but the idea or the expectation that everyone should have hope. And part of that, I think, is because there are so many, but so many core issues for such a large majority of the world that has never been addressed, sometimes even acknowledged, let alone resolved. So, so I think unless we bring all those voices into the climate conversation, the lived experience of racism, of sexism, of ableism, and so on and so forth, it will be reduced to a very small minority of people who care about the climate, and we absolutely should. But there won't be any engagement beyond that because it isn't the first item in the agenda of people who are trying to survive.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's a privilege to care about the environment in some senses.
Unless, again, we have the people in the room and we have an intersectional approach that values and firstly secures the safety of people so they can then participate.
Well, thank you so much, George, for this fascinating discussion on Larpocrasy, accessibility and sustainability. If listeners want to learn more about Larpocrasy, where can they find information?
We are on Instagram and on LinkedIn and maybe even on Facebook still. Larpocrasy as LARP, live action role play, ocracy as in democracy. So if you search for Larpocrasy social media, you'll find us.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. This podcast is brought to you from the Creative Futures Research Centre and the Sustainability Development Unit at the University of Greenwich. So, from all of us here, see you next time.